Karima Brown. It's Sunday morning and it's time for The Fix. Welcome to this edition of The Fix, where every Sunday we hold decision makers accountable. We tell you why it matters and how it affects you and why you should care. Now, land reform in South Africa remains an emotive issue. Moreover, the proposed changes to the Constitution has often divided the country, and the government has had to steer and navigate the choppy waters of different interest groups who are all invested and interested in the outcomes of how exactly the reform will be handled. Joining me to discuss the issue this morning is the Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development Minister, Thoko Didiza. Minister, you've got a long title, but thank you so very much for joining us here on this panel. Now, of course, I asked you a while ago to come on. You had some other commitments, but the reason I wanted you to come on was, of course, this report that came out on the land reform process that you had put together as a consequence of the panel. Now, let me dive straight into the controversies of what some people would say is this report. The report recommends that the Ingonyama Trust must be reviewed as a matter of urgency. In fact, it says the government has been handed a political hot potato by the Presidential Expert Advisory Panel on Law and Agrarian Reform, which has recommended that the Ingonyama Trust either be reviewed or repealed. Now, you've said government will study the matter. You've studied the matter. Are you repealing the Ingonyama Trust?
Well, Karima, thank you very much. And I think it's important for me to appreciate that you have given us this opportunity to talk to you, but also to the public of South Africa about the important matter of land in our country. As you say, that the expert panel, the advisory panel on land reform and agrarian development, had been put to actually assist government, one, to assess, the whole landscape in relation to land reform, but also to look at policies and legislation that could be hindrances in terms of the pace of land reform, but also look at what are other difficulties thereon and provide some proposals on how we can move forward as a country, both in policy, legislation, and programmatic intervention. So the panel has made its investigation. They've had various consultations with various stakeholders, and they've come up with recommendations, one of which is the one you are raising about the Ingonyama Trust. I think it's important for me to also say that the issue of the Ingonyama Trust, though it arises from the report of the advisory panel, it had a reason in the high-level panel, which was chaired by President Karima.
And just to pause you there, Minister, what was really interesting was that Karima Motlanthe said, choose the people, not the chiefs. And this report reinforces that understanding. In fact, it says here, the report says there were many instances of a lack of public accountability by the board regarding the finances of the trust and the top-down imposition of the lease system on land already owned by the people. And then it goes on to say that the panel recommends the trust be reviewed, possibly repealed, as the act, and this is what is really important constitutionally, it says it perpetuated the existence of KwaZulu-Natal as a homeland within a unitary state 25 years into our democratic order. So that is actually the nexus of the matter. You have here a last-minute intervention to get the IFP onto the ballot paper in 1994, but we have essentially a homeland system in a unitary country, South Africa. There's a constitutional clash, isn't there?
Actually, I was just giving a narrative also to say, even the Portfolio Committee, when we went to present our annual performance plan, they raised this issue. And it's important for me to indicate that the issue of Ingonyama Trust is not just the matter of the panel or of the communities living in the Ingonyama Trust land, but it is also a matter that other traditional leaders in South Africa has actually raised as an anomaly in terms of the governance system of our country as it relates to traditional areas.
Minister,
but also,
sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
Just for our viewers' sake, when you say the other traditional leaders says it's an anomaly, can you just explain that,
That
why that anomaly
Yes.
exactly? Yes.
The anomaly is, in the current governance system, land under traditional areas are under the trusteeship of the Minister of Land Reform, or Land Affairs as it was known before. And you then have a dispensation where part of that land in respect of KwaZulu-Natal is governed by a trust. So other traditional leaders are saying, if this dispensation is working, why is it not translated across traditional areas in South Africa? If not, why shouldn't it be reviewed? So I think the case for review of the trust, in my view, is there, and it has merit. But also, the other issues that it relates to that review is, what is the relationship between the Ngonyama Trust, the communities on the traditional land, which is under Ingonyama Trust, benefiting from whatever the trust is doing? What is the level of consultation and governance that involves communities, so that where their land is being developed, they are actually part and parcel of those decision-making? So there are many areas that has been raised. One can argue maybe and say it's anecdotally, but the issue is that there are concerns. But also, you'd recall that in the amendment of 1997, it also instructed that the board must transfer those townships that were under Section 239, like Yomlazi and others, which were part of KwaZulu government then, and therefore, in terms of the Ngonyama Trust, were under the Ngonyama Trust, that those actually must be governed by municipal councils. You'd recall that there was even a case involving a eThekwini municipality and Ngonyama Trust around some of those issues. So in earnest, what the panel raises about the need for a review, I would actually say it is important and it's timely.
Now, the fact that the Ingonyama Trust is not accountable to you as the minister, it is literally not run the way other communal land is run, that traditional authorities have powers over, is of course a matter for the Constitution. Now, in today's City Press, the editor, Monle Makanya, writes a scathing piece on King Goodwill Zwelithini, saying that he actually puts himself above the Constitution. In fact, he said he had a problem with the Constitution, and this is what Mondli writes, and he says there's this Constitution that places a president above me. Now, Minister, we are a constitutional state. We obviously recognize different forms of traditional leadership. There is a house of traditional leaders. Why is the king suggesting that he is above the president, if Mr. Makanya is to be believed?
Well, let me say that I've read the article by Mondli. Indeed, he made certain reflections about what the king might have said and his own interpretation of it. I would actually wouldn't want to enter into that discourse, because I believe that King Goodwill, as part of the citizens of South Africa, understands very well that we are a constitutional democracy. Maybe what is unique about our own constitutional democracy, maybe not so unique like others, we have accommodated our own reality, lived reality in our country, that we do have traditional leadership in our country that is respected by their communities. And in ensuring that it becomes part of the governance system, we've actually got structures such as the National House of Traditional Leaders, we've got the provincial houses, all of which that builds a relationship between your constitutional state and your traditional leadership system in our country.
Now, this is Women's Month. We've just celebrated National Women's Day, but the whole of August is Women's Month. And of course, we know that many people who till the land, either as subsistence farmers or as tenants or even as independent farmers, are in fact women. To what extent, Minister, is the land reform process taking a gendered perspective on this all-important question? Because let's say, for example, land under traditional custodianship often, don't honor the rights of women, particularly if they are widows, child-headed households where the child looking after the rest of the family is in fact a girl. How does the reform process ensure that we look at South Africa's land question in a gendered way and in a way that empowers women and don't take away their rights or treat them as the custodians of men?
Certainly you are correct. President, in the national celebration of Women's Day, actually emphasized that we need to deal with that reality in our country where treatment of women, particularly in ownership of land and property, it's still not what it should be. And that as a state, we have to make a deliberate effort to ensure that our policies, our legislation are gendered in such a way that it recognizes, the ownership of land and property by women as equal to men. And it also says, in terms of our programmatic intervention, how do we ensure that in the way in which we address land inequity in our country, we don't only look at it from a racial perspective, but we also look at it from a gendered perspective. And as we transform our rural areas, how do we ensure that your communal tenure system is not discriminative to women as owners, even girl children, to be heirs of land in their communities? Interestingly, when Ms. Gloria Sarobe of Wiphold decided to invest in agriculture, made an interesting choice that one wouldn't have thought of. Instead of going to freehold area, she actually decided to go back in the Eastern Cape in Tsendane, an area that is under communal traditional leadership system. And that's where she's actually working with the women and tilling the land. And one of the issues she has raised in the conversation, together with Imbumba Yamakosgazi, women who are married to chiefs, interestingly, are raising this issue of ownership of land by women and girl children as an important area to be addressed.
But Minister, we are 25 years into the democracy. It cannot remain a question that is raised.
Yes.
What I want to know is, are you in a position to give my viewers an opportunity to see how much land is actually owned by women? Do you have any gender data? Because there's a saying that says you can't measure that which is not counted,
Precisely.
right? So let's measure this commitment to gender equity as it relates to land. How much land are in the hands of women? Do you even have records that can take us there?
I don't think at the moment we can actually say we've got records that can take us there, even though in terms of our land acquisition, we've actually had targeting, women specifically and young people. But I will have to come back to you in this program to then say, on one
in Women's Month still.
In Women's Month still, possibly, if we get the time, that within the 25 years, how much of the land that we've transferred has gone to women, headed household, but also to women as entrepreneurs, both in terms of our agricultural reform as well as land reform in particular.
Now, you don't have opposition only from traditional leaders and people like King Goodwill Zwelithini from the Ngoyama Trust. You also have resistance from organized agriculture. They are, in fact, very or decidedly against the proposition that the land without expropriation clause in the Constitution be a lot more specific about how exactly this is going to happen. They're also arguing that you're not looking at the realities of what is happening on the land and that there's an exaggeration of the rights of tenants who have traditionally, been on the land. The report makes certain recommendations. Firstly, take us through the recommendations that people who have traditionally tilled the land, how are they going to be accommodated in terms of ownership? And how are you going to engage with a business community? Because you're also the Minister of Agriculture.
Yes.
So obviously things like food security and the big agricultural players that are, in generally speaking, white hands, how are you going to interface with them on this question?
Well, firstly, if we can start on the constitutional question, there has been a constitutional review process that was undertaken by the fifth administration in Parliament, which took almost 8 months to really ask citizens a question whether, in their view, the constitutional dispensation in respect of property clause is actually adequate. And there were competing views. Others were saying the constitutional clauses as they stand on Section 25 are actually inadequate. Others were saying, no, they are adequate enough. The state can do what it needs to do in terms of dealing with issues of land inequity. But there were others that said, yes, it may be, but it's not explicit. And therefore, the committee that was dealing with that presented its report to Parliament, which then agreed that there must be an amendment of the Constitution to make what is implicit explicit. Basically, if you look at Section 25, subsection 2, it actually says the state can expropriate in the public interest.
Just quickly, Minister, we're running out of time. Give me a time frame for when this amended version of Section 25 will be ready, and when will it, in effect, be voted on so that the law can be changed?
Well, at the moment, I don't think it would be correct to give a timeline, because that's a parliamentary process. It's not necessarily in the hands of the executive to determine when that should be. And I know that the Speaker of the National Assembly, as well as the Chairperson of the National Council of Provinces, they are aware of the importance of this issue, and they will do what is necessary.
Final question to you, Minister. We've seen in other places where land has been transferred, often the politicians use the name of the people, but when the land is actually transferred, you will see that it's actually in the hands of government officials, ministers, and so on. We know, for example, quite a few ministers are farmers. Our finance minister is a farmer. Our minerals minister is a farmer. Mr. Raul Khoza is a farmer. Where is the audit that tells us how much of the land ordinary South Africans are actually having? Because we've spoken about this audit, but we've never been given the actual data on who owns what and whether the land is actually owned by senior government ministers as opposed to ordinary South Africans.
Well, I think we need to make a separation, because the category of people you are mentioning, like Minister of Finance, Raul Khoza, and others, those have actually gone to the private market and made their own acquisition. And there are many South Africans who have actually taken that route, either on a lease basis or on a acquisition, full acquisition,
yes,
where they own such properties. But you've got beneficiaries of land reform, either through restitution or land redistribution, where the state has actually acquired for the communities and individuals who have approached the state for the acquisition of land for their agricultural development. But what is important is to deal with the corruption, because it is perceived that it's there, and the report also touches on it, that we do need to deal with that issue, particularly on how we address the issue of beneficiary selection to ensure that the right people actually do receive the land. Also, one of the instructive points in the report is that land reform should not only be seen as land reform for agricultural development, yes, but it must also deal with urban special planning and also industrial development.
In fact, I was going to squeeze in a last question of that. Many people believe that when you talk about land reform, you're only talking about agricultural land. But, I mean, the land hunger is actually in the cities. It's actually in the urban areas. Minister, just give us the stats. How many people own in urban areas land, and what is that in ratio to the population, and how are you going to go about making sure that people actually have access to land? Are you going to do what Herman Mashaba is doing and take private buildings and take them for public use when it suits you and when you want to make statements against illegal immigrants, or are you going to actually have a rational approach to this?
Actually, we have to have a rational approach to this so that it is sustainable. sustainable. It mustn't be ad hoc. It must also not be populist, in my view. It must address the needs of our people. We do need to have correct data about who owns land in the urban areas.
But we've had 25 years to try and get that data. We still don't have it.
Well, that may be a criticism which indeed we must take as government to ensure that our data is actually there and is quantifiable. Part of what, the land audit has been doing has been done in phases, has been looking at who owns the land in South Africa, generally either trust, you remember the report on foreign land ownership, but also there's been data in terms of transfer of land, in terms of restitution and redistribution, which is pegged at 11% the most. And if you look at that statistic, very minuscule.
Yeah.
It doesn't touch the 13% of land, by the then National Party, which therefore means there's a long road to go. But in order for us to do that, we need to have a very strong statistics unit, in my view, in the Department of Land Reform that is going to track on a continuous basis both urban and rural land that has been transferred.
Minister, we will, of course, track your own implementation of that process and have you back on the show. Thank you so very much for making time to come on as Minister. Thoko Didiza, of course, there speaking to us. After the break, we speak to the SABC board chair about its report into editorial interference and the broadcaster's soccer matches blackout. Don't go anywhere.